When people picture powerful empires and grand ruins, they generally think of the great ancient empires of the Old and New Worlds, and even inside of Oceania, certainly not the powers of Micronesia. However, this part of the world was not without its own fascinating states, one of the most fundamental of which is the great Saudeleur dynasty of Pohnpei. In today's video, I would like to delve into the history of empire on this island of the Carolines, the effect that the Mwehin Saudeleur had on later politics, both on Pohnpei and in Greater Micronesia, and perhaps their most famous accomplishment, the construction of Nan Madol, the Venice of the Pacific. My source for much of this video will be the Book of Llewellyn, a native Pohnpeian account of the island's history. This piece was written in an important time, after missionaries had introduced written language, but before cultural practices and traditions had been lost, allowing the author, Llewellyn Bernard, to produce a record of Pohnpei's past from the first mythological migrations to the German mandate under which he lived. According to legend, the first settlers of Pohnpei were a group of 17 men and women from the south, who landed upon the island, which was already populated by a race of small cannibals. These colonists lived in peace with the cannibals for several generations, until they, quote, became enlightened and became unfriendly to the dwarves. There was a great war between the two groups, eventually resulting in all the dwarves being killed or driven off the island. Even after this war, men would often carry around spears, as, Llewellyn claims, they liked to kill people for little cause at that time. More likely, Lapita-era settlers from the Solomon Islands or Vanuatu discovered the island and settled it, quickly growing in numbers due to its rich natural resources. They brought such fruits as breadfruit, known as mahi in Pohnpeian, the mulberry, the mango, bananas, and more. As for crops, pandanus, yams, and taro were brought and cultivated. Giant swamp taro, or muang, flourished in the incredibly wet environment of Pohnpei. The quality of their food also increased, as Olapat, the trickster god, taught the settlers the gifts of fire. In this era, the men only wore a loincloth Llewellyn called Kiyin Muin Kalan, while the women wore sheets of bark cloth wraps, whose name the author did not provide. This period, referred to as the Mwehin Kawa, or period of building, is the first of the island's three traditional pre-contact eras. This era was marked by a lack of central government, the anarchy of the people being emphasized heavily in the text. In chapter 20, Llewellyn mentions the fact that the first settlers, quote, had few words and did not have any great work. The translators attest that this refers to ceremonies, feasts, and large structures that were present in the later eras. This section of the book features Bernard's conclusion that, quote, the people of this age are better than those of olden times. The age of anarchy began its decline when yet another group of voyagers arrived on Pohnpei. This group, much taller than the native Pohnpeians, was led by the twin sorcerers Oljipa and Oljopa, and arrived from the mythical land of Katau Patai, or West Katau, a mythological land to the west that may correspond with the island we now know as Yap. Their massive one-masted, three-sailed boat arrived off the coast of Pohnpei, on an island called Yaupai. I couldn't find this island on any contemporary maps, but the book lists it as being in the south of Madol state. From here, the brothers sailed around the island to survey it, and upon finding the islet of Mwehin, off the east coast of Madolenium state, they decided to settle down. Here they assembled all the anarchic people of Pohnpei to help them construct houses and roads, which they happily did. Once they had houses, Oljipa and Oljopa magically lifted up stones from the channel until it stood above the water. Llewellyn tells us that they gave this place the name of Nan Mulujai, an old name for Nan Madol. Their place of residence in this complex was an island they called Nantawaj, an old name for Nan Doas, the residence of the Saudeleur. Through this magic, the twin sorcerers gained the respect of the Pohnpeians and were adopted as their leaders. The construction of these first islands is generally dated to 800 or 900 AD, and marks the beginning of the Mwehin Saudeleur, the second era of Pohnpei's native history. Also known as the Age of the Lords of Deleur, Deleur being an old native name for East Pohnpei where the dynasty began, this era was one of the first occasions of centralized empire in Oceania. Only West Polynesia had reached a comparable level of splendor. After Oljipa died, his brother Oljopa became the first sole Saudeleur king, or Yao, and established a law of hereditary rule. Their rule was in a fashion similar to European feudal nobility, with a collection of local chiefs who ruled the districts and towns of the island appointed directly by the Yao. In the early days of the Mwehin Saudeleur, the local chiefs served the Yao from the land they held in fief, but as the era continued and the Yaoite became more corrupt, the vassals were forced to live on Nan Madol so they could be watched more closely. This transition is reflected in Llewellyn's text through his list of the 8 Yao of the Mwehin Saudeleur. Number 1. Oljopa, the first lord of Deleur. 2. Monmwe, this man followed Oljopa. Inenenmwe, this man was very respected. Yakonmwe, this man was haughty and presumptuous. Jaraikinjap, this man had magic power. Raipuinlan, this man was rich and removed from the people. Raipuinloko, this man ate the flesh of people. And finally, Yautamoy, he was the man who sank in the time of war. Nan Madol was the center of the Pohnpeian political world for the duration of the Saudeleur era. It is likely that its population was around 1,000, which is impressive given that the entire island had no more than 25,000 people at the time. Even more impressively, the more than 90 islets of the complex were formed of stone and coral fill, and reinforced with 5-ton basalt pillars stacked up to 25 feet high, while the islet of Pohnpei features boulders of up to 90 tons piled also to around 25 feet. This stone was moved remarkably through the use of advanced pulley systems somewhat reminiscent of Rapa Nui. However, this also leaves a question unanswered. Mwehin Island, being a coral islet, has no bedrock. Where was all this stone produced in the first place? Quarries on the west side of Pohnpei, fully opposite from Nan Madol, seem the likely contender. Archaeologists believe that the immense boulders could have been floated over on reinforced rafts, but this process has never been demonstrated, so at the moment we truly don't know how the great rocks of Nan Madol made their way to the complex. Life in Nan Madol was also very vibrant and interesting. Given its location on artificial islets, no food or fresh water could be produced, and thus the entire population was dependent on boat deliveries from the mainland. The Yao himself received only food that had traveled through the islets of Penyat and Osanam, being blessed by religious leaders on each. As for the population, only a small group were actually the elites, that being the political and spiritual leaders and their relatives. The majority of the complex's residents were commoners who served the whims of the elites and assisted in religious rituals. The majority of the islands, especially in the northeastern sector of Madol Pawe, served as mortuaries where the remains of prominent figures were kept. The other islands were occupied by homes for the priestly class or nobility, or had special purposes. For example, the islet of Dapahu was home to the complex's canoe builders, while Pinering hosted a large coconut preparation site. Nan Madol's affairs were also presided over by a sort of chief of staff, the Yao Ponte Yao, whose roles included overseeing that the nobles and priests were well attended to and ensuring the presence of necessary people at important stately events, including religious rituals and ceremonial showings of force around the island of Pohnpei. However, despite its great splendor in years past, Nan Madol is obviously a ruin today, which begs the question, how did the Mwehin Saudeleur come to an end? Well, as we know, the Saudeleur rulers had become more and more autocratic over time, disrespecting native religion and requiring greater tribute from the island's people. This culminated, as Llewellyn tells us, in the reign of Yao Tamoy. This Yao enforced unnecessarily harsh religious restrictions, requiring that the people of Pohnpei not eat many types of common food and instead give them to the nobles at Nan Madol. According to legend, he also punished rule breakers with incredibly difficult quests. Llewellyn recounts the actions of the thunder god, Luhk Nahnsapwe, in defense of the Pohnpeian people. In the periods of the lords of Deleur, as they followed one after another, some of them were good, some of them were bad, some of them were oppressive and cruel and bad. This caused the thunder god to proceed to Apun Katao, also known as Kosrae, and visit a woman relative of his who was a clansmate named Lipanmai. He gave her fruit of a tree named Motokai to eat. Now when she tasted it, it made her shudder. She then became pregnant and bore a boy and gave him the name of Isokelekel. For much of his early life, Isokelekel lived on his father's royal canoe, where he was told of the autocratic Yao and his many atrocities. When he reached maturity, Isokelekel decided it was time to depart for Pohnpei. His father supplied him with 333 powerful companions, who advised the demigod that they should first stop at Ant, an atoll some 6 miles away from the mainland of Pohnpei. Here they learned of the cultural practices of the Pohnpeians and devised a strategy to conquer the island and remove the Yao from power. When they felt it was time, Isokelekel and his companions set sail for the mainland. Upon arrival, they immediately rushed to Nan Nahnsapwe, the ceremonial home of the thunder god, where they performed rituals assuring the favor of Isokelekel's father. The Yao, who had been keeping a close eye on the party since their arrival on Amt, was concerned by this knowledge. However, he was missing one key detail: who led the group. Wishing to dispatch them before they could make too much of a scene, the Yao sent a delegation inviting the group to the kingly residence in Nan Madol. They stayed here for a time, but while his companions mingled with the nobility of the complex, Isokelekel, quote, took an old servant woman. This is where he deigned to obtain his ideas from this woman, about the earth and its contents, and also about their types of food and the like, and also about their work and warfare and so forth. Now at all times, those who had immigrated were hunting for things which would begin to help them in conquering Pohnpei. End quote. Armed with this knowledge, Isokelekel became confident in his odds. He commanded his companions to throw rocks at the warriors of Nan Madol. However, his attack did not go as smoothly as he would have expected. The Saudeleur warriors took up defensive positions and forced the invading army out of the complex and onto the island of Mwehin. Here, the two armies stopped and armed themselves more fully. Llewellyn tells us of their weapons. They, quote, fought with spears. They had javelins about 6 feet long, and one man would carry one of these. Other men carried slings, and others had stingray points. They made shafts for them of the aerial roots of the Rhizophora mangrove, and one person would carry a bundle of stingray points. Now one man would carry one bundle of stingray spines, about 10 tied in a bundle, for stabbing people, and as the slings and the content of these sling stones, round stones, they were also adept at throwing stones to kill people. This was the equipment of war for Pohnpei. End quote. Now fully armed, the army of Yao Tamoy began a devastating offensive, pushing back the foreign troops over a number of days. However, the second in command of Isokelekel, Nan Paratok, according to Llewellyn, decided he would no longer retreat, and stuck a spear in his foot. This rallied the invaders, and they proceeded to continue forwards and attack the other troops. Isokelekel noticed the skill of the opposing general and ordered him captured rather than killed. The capture of the leader scattered the troops of the Saudeleur and opened a clear path back to Nan Madol, from where Yao Tamoy was driven and forced into a river, where he transformed into a fish, bringing to mind Llewellyn's commentary that he was, quote, the man who sank in the time of war. Hi, thank you so much for watching. That is the end of this episode on Nan Madol and the Mwehin Saudeleur. I will probably not upload for the next 4 weeks because of like AP tests and stuff. But yes, thank you so much for watching, and I will be back in 4 weeks. Bye.